Yes, we are on.
Okay. All right. Well done. Welcome and thank you everybody for joining us. This event is organized by the CLEA Research Group. CLEA, as some of you know, stands for Cognition, Language, Enactivism, and Affectivity. The group was founded in May of 2020 with the purpose of uniting researchers from different places around related themes and interests. And despite contemplating a wide spectrum of theoretical positions and inclinations, the group assumes that cognitive, linguistic, and affective processes cannot be understood outside the agent-situated activities in his or her physical and social environment. So you can find us on the X, Twitter, under the name Clea Fio. I'll ask Felipe to please write the address in the chat while I talk. And so please follow us there so that you can know about future events like this, as well as the group's activities. If you want to know more about the group, you can also visit our website at the address clea.group. I think Felipe will also write the address in the chat as I speak. So, considering the growing interest in enactivist approaches, we're launching a series of events called the Future of Enactivism. This is the second event of the series, and so our goal is to gather researchers interested in discussing the possibilities, the challenges, and the future directions of enactivism as a research program. So questions like where is it headed, what are its key issues, and how and if we can handle them. So in order to help us tackle with these questions today, we're really glad to have with us Jodie Russell and Michelle Maiese. So I'll make a quick introduction of both, and then I'll tell you how we are going to proceed. So Jodie Russell is a teaching fellow at the University of Edinburgh. Her work concentrates on criticizing models of mental disorder from the perspectives of phenomenology, embodied cognition, and feminist theory. Today, she's going to present us a recently published work criticizing enactive models of mental disorder. As for Michelle Maiese, she's a professor of philosophy at the Emmanuel College in Boston. Her research examines topics in philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychiatry, such as the nature of psychopathology and the integration of emotion and cognition. Today, she's here as a critical commentator of Jodie's work and, of course, to present her own view. Now, this is how we're going to work. First, I'll ask Jodie to give us a talk. She'll have 40 minutes for that. Then Michelle has up to 30 minutes to make her comments and present her own view on the matter. After that, Jodie has another 10 minutes to reply Michelle's comments. And finally, after that, we'll open the discussion to the audience. So everybody here will be able to ask questions for both Jodie and Michelle, and we'll have another 40 minutes for that. So now, if everything's in place, I'll invite Jodie to begin her talk. So Jodie, thank you for being here, and whenever you're ready.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me. This is a bit of a kind of exciting and unusual circumstance to present on a published paper that I actually haven't presented to an audience before. So I am interested to see how I cope with presenting this paper, but I'm also interested to hear what other people will think of it. So I'm going to be kind of presenting on a specific application of enactivism, which is enactive psychiatry. And this paper kind of started life as an attempt at trying to critique a framework that I felt was overall quite strong. So we will kind of like see towards the end, or trying to get towards the end, what I think is really great about enactive psychiatry, but maybe kind of like point towards in the theme of this kind of series, what some kind of future considerations for when we're applying enactivism in the domain of psychiatry. So just to kind of like clarify that I'm not a hater. I love enactivism. I'm a big fan. I think it's got a lot going for it as a framework, and it has a lot going for it within the domain of psychiatry. When I kind of like started my PhD, which is when this paper started developing, I was reading a lot of very, very early work on enactive psychiatry in like 2020, during the pandemic, no less. Kind of like thinking about it and thinking like this was something that I was really interested in, and kind of like making a connection between like this theory of mind and also like to the domain of mental disorder. But I was finding as I was reading that even though it was something like I felt like was very fruitful, I wasn't totally convinced that it was a better framework for understanding mental disorder compared to some of like the competing models that are also on the market. And I'll kind of like get into like what I think are some of the issues that doesn't necessarily make it kind of like peak out above the others. So this paper is essentially just kind of like my attempt to kind of like articulate what I felt were practical opposed to theoretical issues when applying the domain to something very practical such as mental health. And I felt like this was a really important point to instigate a kind of critique of enactivism and a critique of enactive psychiatry, as I was starting to see kind of this work come out in the early 2020s. And I felt like it was really strong. And so I was like, well, maybe what's needed is kind of like a little bit of a kind of like critical take to help kind of like steer the direction of this work. So this is kind of like partly what this paper is trying to do. So to give you kind of an overview of what I will do, I'm kind of going to outline what enactive psychiatry is. I'm kind of anticipating that for many of you that have come to this group, that you are already kind of like at least implicitly aware of like what enactivism is. So I won't spend too much time kind of explaining the key ideas there, but kind of like focus on what are the key principles that enactive psychiatry draws on, and kind of like give you an overview of like the three main views as I see them, and then kind of like highlight what their general similarities and differences are. And then I'm going to kind of like assess what I think the goals of enactive psychiatry are, because in part what I'm making is a slightly contentious claim that I'm hoping Michelle will kind of pick me up on in the commentary, that enactive psychiatry has like practical goals or practical implications, and that's kind of where I take my issues from. And then I'm going to outline what my overall problems are, and hopefully if I have some time towards the end, I'll kind of like hint at what I think the like future directions of like the area should be. So to give you an idea of what the kind of like key concepts are, enactive psychiatry is mostly drawing on the autopoietic strand of enactivism. So this is drawn from like such kind of like classic texts.
Jodie, I'm really sorry to just interrupt you quickly, but we're still seeing your first slide. I don't know if it's supposed to be moving.
Oh no! Yes, they are supposed to be moving. Hang on one second.
Yes. Now we're on the key concept.
Okay, I'll keep it small, and then thankfully I didn't put any embarrassing notes down the bottom, because that's usually where I hide silly things that I don't want other people to read.
Okay. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, you haven't missed much other than this is what the overview is going to look like. So yeah, the kind of key idea or the principle behind enactive psychiatry is mostly drawing from the embodied mind and this autopoietic version of enactivism. So that's not necessarily opposed to, but separate from, say, sensory motor enactivism and radical enactivism. They're mostly drawing on this kind of like this idea of like this principle of mind and life, this life-mind continuity thesis, and this idea like organismic organization is kind of like really what is at the heart of like what makes us kind of like cognizant beings. So what's kind of like the interest or the object of interest for enactive psychiatrists are people, understanding people as organisms who are having to navigate challenges in the environment. And these are particular people that we want to ascribe mental disorder to. So within that kind of like dynamic, what do we understand the disorder to be exactly? So it's supposed to be an account of not just like mind and life, but also as health as well. So what autopoiesis kind of like dictates is that in order to be a living thing, we must maintain ourselves. To be a living thing is to be a self-maintaining thing. And when one stops sustaining oneself or being able to maintain one's organismic boundaries, one ceases to live, and that gives life and mind is like strongly normative character, and you can already kind of see where like this like notion of like health and illness could be applied. So in order to kind of like be a kind of like successful autopoietic system, you have to kind of like appropriately navigate the kind of challenges that the environment poses, and they can be a variety of things of like, things like compromises to one's physical being in terms of like the climate or the dangerousness of the environment, and just challenges to like getting proper food and resources that the body needs to maintain itself. And so we have to kind of like participate in not just kind of like bouncing off these feedback from the environment, but also like appropriately responding or making sense of what these features of the environment mean for us. And that also means just kind of like not just necessarily assessing things as being good or bad, but having a kind of like a graded understanding of these features of environment as being representing situations that are better or worse for our being. So that means like ascribing kind of like very varied meanings to the environment. And so these principles kind of like are really at the heart of what enactive psychiatry is trying to do in terms of trying to understand what health and illness should be. And I'm kind of drawing my main players in this area from Christopher Nielsen, Sanaka Dehan, and Michelle Maiese. And so what they're kind of doing is taking these ideas of like organisms being self-maintaining systems, and then trying to understand, well, where does disorder come in that respect? And it's important to note that these counts, although separate, are not necessarily in competition with one another. And I think that they have aspects which are complementary, and they kind of like emphasize or have slightly different goals in terms of applying enactivism that I'll kind of like demonstrate in a moment. But to kind of go through one by one how each of them is deriving their account, Christopher Nielsen in particular is drawing an idea of what health and disorder is based on this idea of naturalized normativity and function. So the goal in his work is really just to kind of help define what mental disorder should be within the domain of psychiatry. So he's kind of got this more prescriptive project of saying, using enactivism to say, like, this is what disorder should be. This is how we should kind of like use the concept of disorder based on enactivism. And in part, what he's trying to do is also solve this kind of integration issue that's at the heart of a lot of psychiatry. This idea of like symptoms of disorder seem to be spread over multiple ontological levels. Like we could find symptoms of disorder, say on the biological level, if you want to point to, say, like particular like patterns in like the physiological expression of a disorder. They could even be like psychological symptoms or even social symptoms. And so enactivism is meant to do the job of kind of like unifying all of those levels as being emergent from these basic biological processes, the autopoietic processes. And to do that, he appeals to this notion of functional norms, which ties these levels into this autopoietic principle. So functional norms are just those that kind of like guide individuals to preserving themselves as biological organisms. And these functional norms are importantly different or can be teased apart from social norms. So a biological functional norm may be something like making sure one eats and drinks sufficiently, whereas a social norm may be something like, oh, we're not supposed to drink. Depending on your religion, you're not supposed to drink alcohol. And drinking alcohol may have like a kind of functional norm to it, insofar as like excessive alcohol drink can be bad for you as a biological organism. But there's also like potentially a social norm involved as well, where like, I don't know, having a beer once a week, this is what I tell myself anyway, having a beer once a week is not going to be bad for me. But nevertheless, I may have beliefs or belong to a particular kind of like faith that may prohibit that. And so what he wants to do with understanding social norms and functional norms is different, is to basically tease apart where we might say that someone ought to not behave in a particular way, and separate that from any kind of like notion of pathologization or anything that could be said to be bad for them as an organism, just because social norms may not track one's health or may not even track illness. So there may be things that are socially prescribed to, not that we shouldn't do, but they don't necessarily map onto the things that are like biologically good or bad for us. However, like, that's not to say that these social norms are kind of like totally irrelevant. It's the functional norms that are kind of like natural and objective. Hence, like Nielsen calls this kind of naturalized normativity. And it's the breakdown of this functional biological norm which indicates that illness or disorder is there. And because social norms themselves aren't the measure of whether illness or disorder is present, although they could overlap, we really have to judge whether someone has a disorder or not based on the perspective of the individuals, what's harmful for them, rather than say like what's harmful for like their social group or what's harmful for like society. And so norms could appear functional or dysfunctional at a group level. So maybe really good for a particular like a community to participate in particular norms for the continuity of the community, but that's not the appropriate level for Nielsen to say that disorder has come about. Nevertheless, these social and group norms are the relevant background to health. Someone's biological or functional norms only make sense within a particular social setting, but it's not that social background that should be itself the decider of whether something can be demarcated as disordered or not. And the Hans account is in my view, kind of like building on or emphasizing a different aspect of this kind of like biological sense making. And she herself is also trying to kind of like solve this integration problem of like, how do these multiple levels in which like disorder symptoms could arise be understood as like meaningfully connected? And part of her account is also like trying to present enactive psychiatry as a more ethical approach to understanding mental disorder. And I kind of like her key contribution to like the discussion, as I see it, is this notion of the existential stance. So in the way that like we may have particular norms or rules or habits, things that we value or don't value, on a social level, we can also take stances towards those particular things that we value. And we can also take stances towards things that may be more functionally driven on a biological level. So one example is, for me at least, is food. So the body needs food in order to continue to survive so that we can metabolize and keep reproducing ourselves and so on. But what food I choose to eat, to a certain extent, I can kind of, within limits, pick and choose, right? So they may have certain dietary requirements that I can't kind of like get out of. I'm allergic to milk. There's nothing I can do about that. As much as I want to be able to eat cheese, I can't will myself to be able to digest it. However, like one good example may be something like, well, the example I use in the paper is of choosing eggs. Eggs is a source of protein I need to survive. I don't have to get my protein from eggs, but let's say I choose to because I like them. I like having scrambled eggs. But I can also kind of like take a stance on that and be like, well, should I choose to have the thing that I prefer? Maybe I would rather pick like something that is a vegan alternative because it's better for the well-being of the animal involved. Or I may just choose kind of like more ethically sourced egg. I might choose from free range opposed to the cheap God knows what happened to that chicken version of the eggs. And so like there are ways I can kind of like move between different options of how I choose to enact my norms, and my norms are also emergent from the actions that I choose to do. My choice to pick like a box of like organic eggs exemplifies my values and my stances. So existential stance taking is kind of like a useful tool for understanding how like our way of behaving has a kind of like self-evaluative aspect, and that will also be kind of implicated in cases of disorder. But what happens specifically in cases of disorder is that these evaluative interactions go awry, and that's where we have that's where we might demarcate cases of disorder on Dahan's account. So I think Dahan kind of like summarizes this very nicely. And she says, psychiatric disorders refer to a more or less stable pattern in how someone's sense-making goes astray. Going astray means that a person's sense-making is not appropriate to or sufficiently grounded in her situation. She finds it difficult to flexibly adjust her sense-making to her situation. This difficulty in adjusting and attuning will often result in overly rigid patterns of interactions. So where disorder comes about then is when this kind of like ability to flexibly take a stance on our situation, on our norms and values, becomes like overly rigid in a kind of like patterned way. So the important thing to kind of take from that is like it's importantly like a pattern of inflexible sense making. And it's also kind of important to emphasize here, like there seems to be like no facts of the matter as to what makes sense making appropriate or inappropriate on a societal level. This is itself kind of kept deliberately vague, because Dahan accepts that maybe what we consider to be appropriate may change depending on the particular social historical place in which we are situated. But what's kind of like at the heart of disorder is an inability to adapt to a changing environment. So the norms at one particular time may be different to another particular time or place. But what we can point to as being disordered experience in this kind of like more objective or naturalistic way is where it's inflexible to responding to the particular kind of like situation in which someone is embedded. So Maiese, I think, adds a nice dimension on top of the previous two by adding this idea of like how our social roles and our agency are also kind of like implicated in disorder from an enactive perspective. So her goal, which is subtly different from Nielsen's, is to also explain how the relevant levels of disorder are integrated. So not just kind of like creating a framework in which we could integrate them, but explaining how they are integrated. So doing more than kind of like just kind of like descriptive work. So enactivism is playing this kind of like extra epistemics role, but also disorder itself has this kind of like slightly different tinge to it, and that it is a kind of global disruption to our various identities. So Maiese has this kind of like really interesting way of conceptualizing the self given an enactive view, and that our like social roles and our social functions are emergent from our need for self-production and self-maintenance. So my role as, say, like Jodie, the teacher, is emergent from but not reducible to these also lower level biological functions and roles. And that creates this kind of like complex web of identities across various levels where Jodie, the teacher, is kind of like my social identity, and that feeds into and is part of what it means to be a kind of like biologically functioning organism. It's my means of earning a living and therefore feeding myself, right, and putting a roof over my head. It's also my way of making myself kind of like mentally stimulated, has motion regulation functions to it. And so that creates these different kinds of identities across these different levels. And all of these identities have to be maintained. And so what the self is kind of just like this general catch-all term for all of these identities across these different levels. So when we are unable to maintain these selves across these levels, again in this structured and patterned way, that's when we have cases of mental disorder. So what's also kind of like important to emphasize is also on this account the mental and the body are importantly intertwined. Maiese wants to keep or try to account for what makes mental illness mental as opposed to somatic illness, but she also kind of like paints or positions the body as an important focal point for mental illness, in that mental disorder has important effects on the body. They're also kind of like relevant for understanding how it impacts our biological functioning. So for example, if you have quite severe anxiety, say, you might have quite bad problems sleeping, and sleeping may then impact other areas of your life. If you sleep badly, maybe you'll find it very difficult to be motivated to do other things like eat properly or take a shower. And so your bodily functioning is impacted by kind of also your mental health. So again, like much like kind of like I think the idea of like what Nielsen and Dehan are drawing on is that it's an inability to flexibly adapt that indicates that disorder is present. And so this means that a person's agency is also importantly compromised. And what's important to emphasize is it's not simply just, again, like one instance of a compromise of agency. It has to be a pattern. If, for instance, we were to say diagnose a particular disorder based on one instance, there might be a kind of concern of like there's not sufficient evidence to kind of like demarcate, say, like having a bad day from having depression. So a pattern kind of indicates that there's something more holistically gone wrong in that person's sense making, rather than say like the sense making kind of like not being very adaptable on a particular occasion. And so what we are looking for when we're looking for, let's say, kind of like healthy agents is this ability to like critically engage with like the structures and the like social norms that surround a person. So this is kind of like useful for distinguishing, say, like someone who may be mentally unwell from, for example, someone who is just under a very like oppressive social political regime. So you may see like similar kind of like symptoms or behaviors or inabilities to flexibly adapt in both situations. But what makes the particular case of someone like who's mentally unwell versus someone who's in like a really rigid social situation of which they have no control is that the person who's mentally unwell may be unable to critically analyze and endorse particular structures or particular ways of being that someone under the political regime may be able to. So even though someone may be kind of like in a situation that they have very little control of, they may nevertheless be able to take up a stance that the situation that they're in is not one that they wish to be in, wish they could be otherwise. So that's also kind of like an important part of the demarcation criteria on this account. So to quickly just kind of go over the similarities and differences. So I think what's the kind of like key similarities are mostly that there's this idea of adaptivity drawn from De Paulo that really kind of like resonates all the way through. The social environment is also something that's like very explicitly like accounted for or like explained using the enactive framework, and it places real constraints on the person and provides them opportunities for exercising their agency. But there's also like this need to differentiate the social environment from the biological functioning of the person. And what also seems to be key is that disorder is assessed on the basis of a pattern of behavior over time rather than on individual instances. And all of the accounts claim to be non-reductive and naturalistic. So their scientific approach is pretty consistent as well. The only real difference between them, I think, is one of emphasis in terms of like the aspects of enactivism that they use. So I think Nielsen tends to emphasize more the notion of functional norms, whereas Maiese also emphasizes the grip on maintaining one's identity, and Dehaene emphasizes kind of existential stance taking. But I don't take these to be fundamental differences such that the accounts are in any way competing with another. I think they are themselves usually grappling onto different aspects of the framework that could approach the same problems in psychiatry from slightly different, although compatible ways. And the only other key difference I can kind of find between them is that they are slightly different in how they are using enactivism. So I think Maiese is kind of like going more on the side of an epistemic role for enactivism. It's explaining stuff, whereas for Nielsen, it's more doing a job of like giving us a conception of disorder that we can then use. And so he kind of like sees the project of psychiatry having these like different like sub projects. One is a kind of like conceptual project, one is kind of like an explanatory project. And for him, at least, the conceptual project is kind of like primary, and then everything else kind of follows. But again, I don't think those are fundamental differences that are crucial for like maybe picking one over the other. So I will kind of like consider the problems for enactive psychiatry from the perspective of like all of their frameworks combined. So this is the bit where it gets nice and spicy and contentious. So I'm kind of like painting enactive psychiatry in this framework as a practical framework. And what I think the practical goals of enactive psychiatry is, it wants to be more ontologically sound. I think that they want to solve these kind of like metaphysical problems in psychiatry. One is the integration problem. So how do these various ontological levels where disorder symptoms could arise, how do they connect with each other? And the other one is a demarcation problem. So how do we separate disordered from non-disordered individuals? And the other one is, I think that enactivism also paints itself as more ethical than its competitors, in part because through this integration of levels, it's trying to integrate lived experience. One thing they point out is that the other models of disorder haven't necessarily led to less stigma for individuals with mental disorder. So I think that there's both like an ontological and an ethical project. And so I see enactivism as trying to solve practical problems in psychiatry, not just theoretical. And these are, of course, also theoretical problems. But I think in trying to solve like these ontological issues, they're also trying to be more ethical. And that itself is kind of like gives it a practical slant. So my kind of like issues with enactive psychiatry come from this assessment of what I think that they're trying to do from a perspective of a science. So yeah, I think ultimately these practical goals create practical problems, and I've labeled these as the interpretation problem and the perspective problem. These aren't labeled as such in the paper itself, but I've found kind of like writing later that these are kind of like useful ways to label them, and I think that they're importantly intertwined. Where we have one, we usually have the other as well. So I think the interpretation problem comes about from using terms like dysfunction and pattern, which are themselves ambiguous and leave the framework open to interpretation by the particular users of the framework. And users could be researchers, they could be clinicians. I mean, theoretically, even patients reading about enactive psychiatry could also be a user of the model, right, for using it for their own self-understanding. I focus more on clinicians or clinical use of enactive psychiatry, but I think users could definitely include researchers as well. So given that they have kind of like a kind of ambiguity, I think to take the example of the word pattern, what constitutes a pattern? Is it behavior over, say, like 3 instances over 1 week, 3 instances over a month, over a year? What counts as an instance? What doesn't count as an instance? These are all kind of like questions that need to be answered before we can kind of like concretely define what a pattern should entail, especially when it comes to disorder symptoms. And given that they have this ambiguity to them, my worry is that social norms may be then smuggled in to kind of like disambiguate particular cases. And this is going to create what Alexandrova calls mixed claims. So mixed claims are just claims that are empirical in nature, but have embedded moral, aesthetic, political assumptions to them. So I think that if enactivism is attempting to be naturalistic, which it is, and wants to find kind of in principle objective standards for health and illness, that they should be a bit worried about the fact that if their framework is deliberately kind of like open-ended like this, there will always be some kind of like non-objective or subjective standards that are used to make this ambiguous project, or this kind of like information-rich project, a more simple one to apply. I realize that this is actually not a bug of enactivism. It's actually a feature that these terms are open to interpretation, in part because they want to understand that social norms are emergent from biological norms in a way that's like non-linear. They can emerge in a way that it's not directly obvious which biological norms are kind of like influenced, or where these social norms are kind of like have exactly like emerged from. So where one ends and one begins is meant to be kind of like a little bit ambiguous, because that's kind of like part of the design of how they are faithfully understanding how life works. And I think that enactive psychiatry can even define health in respect to social norms. I think we see this a bit in Dahan's case. So this isn't an initial kind of like theoretical issue for their framework. This is something that they've kind of built in. Nevertheless, like I think this creates some practical issues in terms of like how to conclude who counts as being as disordered or not, let's say for the purposes of diagnosing patients or even recruiting research participants. And this runs into the second problem, which is the perspective problem. So if we accept that there are kind of like embedded values that we might use in order to determine what we count as a dysfunction or a pattern, whose values should we then apply when we interpret enactivism? And this problem comes about, I think, by the fact that like social values interpretations themselves are not homogeneous. One researcher and one clinician from the next is not necessarily going to have the same approach, and they may even conflict with one another. So what's dysfunctional from one person could be completely functional from another. And I use this example of self-harm in the paper, which is actually a case study that Nielsen talks about, and he mentions how complicated this particular case is. And I think it is a particular sticky one to try and kind of like apply enactivism to, because from one perspective, it's an emotion regulation strategy. It may not be a particularly desirable one to use. It does involve harm to one's body, and in particularly dangerous circumstances, it could even result in death. But if one has no other emotion regulation strategies available, and it does perform the function of regulating one's emotions, which is arguably important for these autopoietic principles, then it could be functional. So there's a bit of a conflict here, depending on how you want to, how you position the particular kind of like individual in question, what values you take up to interpret whether their behavior is kind of like functional or not. And enactivism itself within like the conceptual toolset that it provides, doesn't give us the resources to adjudicate in such cases. So if I'm a clinician or if I'm a researcher deciding to look into dysfunctional forms of like self-harm, and I can see like there's a potential way of reading a particular case where it actually doesn't look dysfunctional, it looks functional. Enactivism itself doesn't allow me to easily make a decision as to whether I should include particular people or not. So that's where the kind of like practical issue kind of arises. So just kind of like to really kind of hammer home the core of the issue. So I think because enactive psychiatry is open to interpretation, wherever we have interpretation, we're going to have the creeping in of social values. And the tools that enactivism itself gives us, which are mostly just tools for understanding where cognition comes from and what is life and even maybe what is health, does not allow us to adjudicate between competing perspectives or interpretations of what is functional or dysfunctional. And it also doesn't then give us the tools, just because we have the capacity to critically take a stance on whether something is functional or not. It doesn't give us the tools necessarily to actually stand outside this critical stance making itself. We have the capacity to do it, but there's no necessity to do it. There's no push to do it. So given that, someone may use enactive psychiatry in a way that just ends up intentionally or unintentionally perpetuating the same norms and values that other models have already used, that enactivism has kind of like taken issue with. So if, for example, lived experience doesn't seem that necessary for your domain of research, even though it's something that you can account for within like the enactive framework, it's not that something that you necessarily have to prioritize, say, when you're being guided by how you're going to decide whether something is functional or dysfunctional. And so you may then just end up, because you're relying on your own values, excluding lived experience out of ease, because lived experience is subjective and messy and sometimes difficult to quantify and use in research. So in that sense, enactivism doesn't necessarily undo some of the harms that other models have similarly done in terms of excluding lived experience of disorder. So in this way, I don't think it's either ethically or more ontologically preferable than any other model for psychiatry. So one possible solution is just to have a pluralistic model. So just this is kind of like the let 1,000 flowers bloom kind of solution. So we could just have a whole bunch of different interpretations of enactive psychiatry that are informed like by a whole range of different perspectives. Allow there to be as many different versions of enactive psychiatry as there can be. And given that there's multiple different perspectives, each one will kind of like grapple onto or cling onto some aspect of reality, and therefore teach us something in its own right about what disorder is. Yeah, so in this sense, you don't have to kind of like throw out enactivism or adapt enactivism to appeal to a specific view or even exclude social values. And then we could even like the different versions themselves, right, could argue amongst each other, right, which they think is kind of like a better approach to understanding mental disorder. But I have worries about pluralism as an approach, in that it, again, doesn't guarantee that we take up moral, ethical considerations of our own values. So you could have, say, like scientists or clinicians doing their own thing in one room, and maybe some kind of like patient-focused clinicians and some involvement of patients working in a separate room, and they don't necessarily have to talk to one another. They could coexist without actually critically engaging with one another, and therefore not actually having to consider their own involvement of their values. And what's kind of like at the heart of Alex and Drover's worry about the science of well-being in general is that a lot of our values are implicit and we may not be aware of them. And so having a pluralism of different approaches doesn't necessarily unpick or uncover what may be kind of implicit biases with how we're approaching or applying enactive psychiatry. So any other issue may be that it's just not practically possible or desirable to allow 1,000 flowers to bloom. That may just be something that's kind of like very much restricted by like the time and the energy of the individuals involved. And also, you know, research and clinical practice costs money, and there's not infinite money to allow for infinite different possible perspectives. So this is just kind of like a quick conclusion and kind of like a wrap up, just to say the things that I like about enactivism and the things that I'm kind of like worried about and the things that I think we should consider going forward. So enactive psychiatry does promise to provide a better model of mental disorder, and I think its goals to want to integrate different levels and also to demarcate disorder from non-disorder are very important goals that we should have. We should want to not pathologize people unnecessarily, and we should want to account for as much of the experience of disorder as possible. And enactive psychiatry does deliberately want to include lived experience, which if you're familiar with kind of like some of the literature in phenomenological psychopathology, lived experience is being highlighted as a really important consideration for overcoming epistemic injustices. So for including people's actual experiences of disorder in how we define disorder, so that we take seriously their testimony and we don't dismiss their testimony, but also it means that they can make sense of their experience using things that have actually been informed by the disorder experience itself. And so in that sense, I think there's a lot of hope that enactivism could provide a much better account of disorder and do all of the things that it wants to do. But I think part of the problem is it doesn't give us clear guidelines in terms of whose perspective we should take, what interpretation of like the ambiguous terms we should use, and what to do when there's disagreements. In that sense, I think it kind of falls short of this ontological and ethical goal. But I think moving forward then, I think that the goal is to really just combine enactivism more strongly with the areas of applied philosophy that are doing all of this work to try and specify and also trying to kind of unpick and critique the norms and values that we use as social scientists, but also, I should say, people in society. I don't think we should leave enactivism to do all the social and critical thinking for us, but combine it with the kind of strands of philosophy that are already doing that and already have a rich history of doing that. So things like social epistemology, feminist philosophy of science, and ethics. And this is kind of like again, a hot take and food for further thought that I've been thinking more about is maybe whether enactivism would do better to give up on the goal of naturalism, to give up on this idea of like a value-free, objective notion of health or illness, and just lean into the value nature of science. And part of this is coming from a bias from my own perspective of liking to read a lot of feminist philosophy of science, and how like it's implicit as an assumption within that there are values in science and there's nothing you can do about that, but let's steer those values towards some things that are actually going to produce some good out of science. And maybe we can do the same for enactivism, is actually embed values in there and then have a more explicit discussion as to, do I want my enactivism to do that for me? Why does it or doesn't it work? How could that interpretation be, say, discriminatory or exclusive of certain perspectives? And then try and understand how like the way of doing cognitive science is itself a value-laden activity, and therefore it will impact how enactive psychiatry conceptualizes its targets of investigation. So that's it. Thank you all for listening. Sorry for rambling or if I went over a little bit.
Okay, Jodie, thank you so much. It's such a great talk. I have to say, I just love the frogs and hats. Not sure why, I just loved it. Okay.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, like, whenever I think of enactivism, I always think of like my prototype of what an organism is, which is always a dog, and always a frog, because I always think frogs are like very well like adapted to their environment. So it's partly because like that's my mental association, but also like I think people should have cute little things to look at while they're trying to digest a bunch of information.
That's nice. That's really nice. Thank you. Okay. I'm going to invite Michelle to begin her talk. Michelle, you have up to 30 minutes to make your comments and present your view to us as you like. So whenever you're ready, feel free to begin. Would you like to share screen?
I would. I'm not super familiar with Google Meet, but I think hopefully I can pull it off here.
There's a button right below the screen. There's a small arrow pointing up. I think that's the button you have to look for.
Yeah, and I'm having trouble figuring out how to. All right. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
All right. Huh. Mm.
I'm not sure which screen you're at, but sometimes it helps to try to share your whole screen rather than just the software or the PowerPoint or the PDF in which your presentation is. I'm not sure at which point.
Because I have it open.
I think now it's working. Let's see.
Okay. Cool.
Okay, we can see actually your whole screen. So you might want to maybe put your presentation full screen. Great.
Like that?
Great. Great.
Okay. Now I can't see you, but oh well.
Yeah, you probably won't be able to see us.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, Jodie. I hope everyone's doing well. And sorry for my tech difficulties here. I think Jodie covers quite a lot of ground in this paper, and I am going to try to highlight some of the key criticisms as I understand them. And I'm going to focus in particular on my version of enactive psychiatry, because obviously that's the version that I know the best. But the key ideas that I'm going to pick up from Jodie's presentation are ideas about mixed claims and the idea that enactive psychiatry makes mixed claims, the notion of mind shaping. And I think mind shaping can be destructive, and I think that's important to keep in mind. And that is related to the interrogation of social norms and trying to figure out which ones are legitimate and which ones might deserve to be more closely critically examined. So, a brief overview of Russell's key worries for enactive psychiatry. This worry that on its own, enactivism doesn't give us the resources to adjudicate between competing perspectives of what is or is not functional or dysfunctional. Enactivism recognizes that social factors influence mental health, but it does not yet provide us with the means to critique those very influences. At best, it can only confirm instances of disorder that our social norms already prescribe as dysfunctional. And at worst, users of enactive psychiatry might actually perpetuate the same norms and values present in other models which enactivism criticizes. And I think this is an important worry that that could just contribute to serious social injustice in psychiatry. Enactivism, according to Russell, should be supplemented with feminist philosophy, in particular, feminist philosophy of science, of ethics, and epistemology. And I think I definitely share some of Russell's concerns. And I think there are some really important issues here that are actually pretty tricky. In a footnote to my 2021 paper entitled An Enactivist Reconceptualization of the Medical Model, I think I wrote this footnote in response to a reviewer, actually. And what I said in that footnote is, there are interesting questions here about which sociocultural norms are justified. To take just one example, problematic norms surrounding what it means to be a good employee in late capitalist societies may be especially challenging for subjects with depression, and those norms deserve to be critiqued. However, a full discussion and interrogation of the sociocultural norms that influence our understanding of mental disorder is beyond the scope of this paper. And at the time, I was thinking, oh, I don't have time to address that in this paper. I don't have the space. And B, this is a really difficult issue that I'm not quite sure I know how to address. Sneaky way of getting out of addressing a difficult problem. But so I agree that there's a question here that needs to be addressed. And I'm fully on board with supplementing enactivism with feminist philosophy. And in fact, I think there are some important resonances here between enactivism and feminist philosophy. For one thing, the emphasis on embodiment, and another is the emphasis on relationality. However, does enactivism have more resources to address these issues than Russell indicates? And as you might guess, I think the answer to that question is yes. But I also think that there's still work to be done here. And what I'm going to say here is definitely not the end of the story, and more needs to be said. But I think it's a beginning of something, hopefully. So one concern that Russell raises relates to the idea that enactivism makes mixed claims about disorder. So mixed claims involve claims that also involve a normative term or have a normative component. And I think Russell's worry, right, there are likely to be biases in interpretation regarding what counts as dysfunctional. Will our values of the moment inevitably get baked in was listed in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It since has been removed, and some would say this is due to changing social values, but arguably it never should have been in there in the first place. You might say it's not a genuine disorder. And I don't think, like, this is not the only example, obviously. I'm not sure. There's a condition called hypoactive sexual desire disorder that was once in the DSM. I'm not sure if it's still there, but women with diminished desire for sexual activity were deemed pathological, and they're having this disorder. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is another example. You might think that problematic social norms are coming into play. But the lurking worry, I think, is that perhaps it's social norms themselves that are the problem, and that we're mistaken in characterizing a particular condition as a disorder. I do think it's true that enactivism makes mixed claims. And the way I see this is at a middle way between naturalism and normativism. So a naturalist account hold that, right, those accounts hold that concepts of health and disorder are predominantly driven by objective natural categories that exist independently of our values and interests. And right, sort of an extreme version of that would be the traditional medical model. A normativist account, on the other hand, emphasizes that the demarcation between health and disorder depends on social norms. And an extreme version of a normativist account would be something like anti-psychiatry, right, who maintain that mental illness is socially constructed. These are just problems in living. Our understanding of disorder is entirely a matter of sociocultural norms. And then you get something like a hybrid naturalist account that is supposed to be, right, a middle way between these two accounts. So something like, I think Wakefield's harmful dysfunction account is a well-known hybrid naturalist account. Where he says that right, disorder is harmful dysfunction, and we get like there's a dysfunction if it causes some harm or deprivation to a person, but only as judged by that person's culture. So right. Dysfunction is supposed to be a scientific, factual term, and harm is supposed to have this important value dimension to it. So like either hybrid accounts, my proposed enactivist account makes mixed claims about disorder. And so the idea is going to be that disorder designations are based on both facts and values. So there's neurobiological dynamics at play that factor into our designation of disorder, but there's also social values at play. Our concepts of disorder and dysfunction they're not value-free. And it would be a mistake to overlook social norms when designating a condition as a disorder. But it would also be a mistake, I think, to overlook neurobiology. And in my view, right, so is this a strength of this account? And I would say yes. I think an adequate account of mental disorder should bring together the normative and the biological. And I also think that enactivism is well positioned to do so because normativity is kind of right there at the get-go. So I think there is some objective basis to the term disorder, but social norms do come into play, but it's not simply right a social construction. So my account, briefly, mental disorder consists in a persistent pattern of sense making that runs counter to an organism's ability to adapt to its surroundings. So while normativity in a basic biological sense has to do with survival and self-maintenance, the adaptivity of human agents obviously goes well beyond this and has to do with adapting and faring well in a social environment. Mental disorder, right? In cases of mental disorder, there's a persistent pattern of sense-making that runs counter to adaptive sense-making, I think, both biologically and sort of in a social sense. And the social sense of faring well, as Jodie outlined, has to do with the enactment of habits and social roles. So mental disorder sort of disrupts people's ability to enact social rules that are important to them. In cases of mental disorder, there's a violation of functional norms, both at the biological scale and the sociocultural scale. So if we talk about something like depression, we could talk about how it impacts people's ability to satisfy basic biological functions, such as sleeping, eating, caring for themselves. What it has in common with bodily illnesses is that it is likely to reduce someone's quality of life, cause them physical distress. There's all these bodily symptoms. But behavior is maladaptive also because it makes it difficult for people to satisfy their social roles in terms of family responsibilities, friendships, workplace responsibilities, etc. There's an important relational component here. Mental disorder involves being out of sync with one's surroundings. And so if that's true, if we talk about relationality, then in a sense, it would be a mistake to put the source of the disorder entirely in the person, right, located there in the person or their brain, or entirely in the social environment. Rather, it has to do with the relationship between the person and their environment. So again, designations of disorder, it's not simply something that is constructed out of social values. There is a neurobiological element at play here. But I think, right, Jodie raises a good point that there may be competing perspectives about what counts as maladaptive. And the case of self-harm, I think, is really interesting. I think there are cases, and I was just talking about depression, that perspectives regarding what counts as dysfunctional are likely to converge in the sense that I think if we have a case of severe depression, we're going to have clinicians saying that, oh, this is maladaptive. We're also likely to have the person themselves saying this is maladaptive, that this is undermining their flourishing. But are perspectives always going to converge? Perhaps not. other instances, there might be a disagreement surrounding whether behavior is maladaptive. And I think Russell rightly points out that self-harm is both maladaptive in a sense, yet also adaptive in a sense. On the one hand, it involves harm to a person's own living body. It might even risk death. They might become overly reliant on self-harm as a form of emotion regulation, and that could compromise their ability to use a wider range of emotion regulation strategies. On the other hand, this might be an emotion regulation strategy that someone relies on because other strategies just aren't available for them. And I think, so on the enactivist view, there's a kind of, you might say, a lack of skillful know-how and a difficulty with emotion regulation that you might say is a disruption between the agent and their surroundings. And so I think we want to say that it's disordered, not simply in the event that it rounds counter to biological adaptivity and the functional need for self-preservation, but that perhaps enactment of these behaviors or habits is going to interfere with the enactment of social roles that are important to the agent. Now, I mean, that might not always be true. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about, and I think Jodie just mentioned the example of like drinking. So if someone, and I think this is very common, someone might use alcohol, drinking alcohol as a strategy for emotion regulation. If they have one drink each day, is that going to be maladaptive? Is it going to seriously undermine their health, interfere with their everyday functioning? Probably not. And so might there be, I don't like cases of mild self-harm where it's sort of less disruptive, less maladaptive or something like that, versus a case where someone is putting themselves in serious harm's way and relying on it to such an extent that it becomes disruptive to their life and their ability to satisfy social roles. So, right, so this is the enactivist response that I'm proposing. We examine whether such behavior is maladaptive, both in a biological sense and a social sense. What risk does it pose? But in addition, I think enactivism is also going to point out and want to emphasize that the problem, again, the locus of this maladaptive behavior, we need to understand that we need to look at this person's social environment and acknowledge that some social environments are especially toxic. Some social environments make it especially difficult for people to adapt and fare well in that environment. So there are also, I think, Russell talks about this notion of mind shaping. And it's important to acknowledge that we are shaped by our social environment. And sometimes, you know, this is a destructive influence that our social surroundings have on us. So this enactivist account of mind shaping characterizes habit formation as socially embedded and guided by shared normative practices. So there are these social expectations, and from early childhood on, people are subject to normative assessment. People alert to them to whether their behavior is acceptable or unacceptable. Just as biological processes of self-maintenance depend on social resources, we form our habits and maintain those habits, and that depends on social resources and the social environment. We form these habits by way of coordinating with others, imitating them, complementing their behavior. And there's a sense in which social norms are internalized and anchored in the body in the form of these habitual modes of engagement, so that we are mind shaped by our social environment. Other people sort of regulate our habit formation, and social norms and expectations encourage certain kinds of habits. In some cases, right, these social influences impact us and mold us in negative ways, namely in ways that undermine our agency and well-being and make it difficult for us to flourish. And so I think that notion of destructive mind shaping puts us maybe, hopefully, in a position to begin to critique the influence of some social influences. Are all social norms equally justified, or you might say equally legitimate? And I think the answer is going to be no. Implicit in Russell's discussion of autism, for example, is the notion that there are some social norms, like neuronormativity, that deserve to be questioned. And it's important because Russell points out, and I think this is right, that autistic persons might even come to mistakenly view autism as a disorder because they have adopted the lens of dominant sociocultural norms. And Russell says that they might even lack concepts that will allow them to interpret themselves as living a good life, and that this counts as a hermeneutical injustice. And I think that's plausible. I also think there are problematic social norms surrounding what it means to be a good employee in contemporary capitalist societies. So, I mean, and namely, I guess the idea would be that the norms associated with being a good employee are overly demanding, definitely in the United States, and I'm sure elsewhere as well. But are those the only social norms that people with depression might find it difficult to satisfy? If so, then I think we would, maybe have questions about whether it's appropriate to consider depression a disorder. But so as I was thinking about this, I was like, okay, so social norms that are overly demanding surrounding what it means to be a good employee, what's expected of people, and then kind of comparing that with social norms that are more centrally related to human well-being and sociality, like norms surrounding ability to care for one's children. And do norms like that carry greater legitimacy? And I'm inclined to say yes. And another way to think about this is, would the sense-making patterns commonly associated with depression make it difficult for someone to adapt and fare well, even in a more just society? And I think, again, the answer is yes. And of course, that doesn't obviate the need for various social supports, but I think I'm left with this sense that some social norms carry greater legitimacy, and others deserve to be more critically examined and questioned, perhaps. So according to my proposed enactivist account, mental disorder can be stood, at least in part, in terms of a lack of flexibility and a decreased ability to adjust to one's surroundings. So where someone has these habitual patterns of sense-making that make it difficult for them to gain a grip on available action possibilities. And this can take place in some cases due to a lack of flexibility or overly rigid habits. But what the idea I'm working with is maybe sociocultural norms can lack adaptive openness or flexibility as well. Maybe there are social cultural norms that can be overly rigid and restrictive, and thereby unduly intolerant of diverse forms of life. After all, human agents, right, we have this diverse range of capabilities, of aptitudes. We have different ideas about what counts as a good life. And so if sociocultural norms are overly restrictive or rigid, that would not allow for diverse modes of flourishing, and it would make it more difficult for people to adapt and fare well. Some degree of normative flexibility promotes agents' ability to fare well in their environment. And when social norms constrain individuals within highly narrow modes of functioning, and for arbitrary reasons, that can make it exceedingly difficult for them to adapt to their surroundings and flourish and live a good life. So social norms that lack that kind of flexibility or adaptive openness would undermine effective agency, and we might be inclined to call those social influences toxic. The case of genders for you. Is it true that enactivism merely confirms instances of disorder that our social norms might already prescribe as dysfunctional? Gender dysphoria remains in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It's associated with significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. There's gender incongruence, allegedly. Agents have a sense that their gender identity doesn't match with their biological sex or the gender assigned at birth. But are these norms overly restrictive? Intolerance of a wider range of gender expressions, we might imagine, creates difficulties not just for people with so-called gender dysphoria, but also cisgender people who find dominant gender norms overly restrictive and limiting. An overly rigid sex and gender binary, one which ties gender identity to biological sex and offers up only two categories for people to occupy, makes it more difficult for agents to adapt and to fare well in their world. And intolerance of a wider range of gender expressions creates difficulties for many different people. And it's easy enough, at least for me, to imagine society with far more fluid gender norms that would make it easier for people to adapt and fare well. This notion that some social norms are overly restrictive, I think, opens up space to question the legitimacy of some of the conditions currently listed in the DSM. The case of autism. The prevailing view is that because autism involves diminished social awareness and social reasoning, it counts as a disorder. But are the dominant norms surrounding social interaction and social cognition, are those norms overly restrictive? And I suspect that is the case. But might there be cases in which autistic persons behave in ways that violate more legitimate social norms? And I was just I don't think this is at all common behavior. I think so. The Shields and Beversdorf talk about a case of an autistic man who becomes convinced that a woman has fallen in love with him, and after meeting her in an employment agency, the woman repeatedly asks him to leave her alone and displays various bodily cues indicating that his advances are unwanted. But these authors say that because of this intense narrow interest becomes overly consuming, and that this is informed by autism. And their question is, could those limitations in the domain of social awareness contribute to disordered behavior? Would we want to make special accommodations, for example, if a case like this went to court? And I think there's an interesting question here, and I'm not entirely sure about the answer. But and again, I don't think that autism is generally associated with behaviors like harassment and stalking. But I guess my question again is weighing instances where we might want to push back and say, no, these social norms are overly restrictive, versus other cases where we think that there are sort of more legitimate social norms that pertain to not harming other people or fulfilling basic, more central norms surrounding human sociality and well-being and that sort of thing. Another sort of case that pertains to Russell's suggestion that we should listen to people. So if someone's telling this person, oh, you have a disorder, and they're saying, no, I don't think I have a disorder, we should listen to people. And if they don't think they have a disorder, we should take that seriously. The perspectives of patients absolutely should be considered when determining what counts as dysfunctional. But the case of psychopathy, for me, raises questions about this idea as well. In some cases, it might be necessary to override a person's perspective on their own condition. Because psychopaths, like people with this condition, they typically deny there's anything wrong with them. And yet they exhibit notable impairments in agency, impulsivity, in many cases exhibiting behavior that not only harms other people, but also runs counter to their own long-term interests. They find it difficult to enact various social roles, sustain various kinds of relationships. They also appear to violate social norms that appear to be more central to the functioning of human societies, those related to truth-telling and avoiding direct harm to others. And I guess is implicit here is that I think these kinds of social norms probably carry some degree of legitimacy. Regardless of which behaviors are plausibly deemed dysfunctional or disordered, I think it's important to break links between being diagnosed with a disorder, and here's where some of the ethical implications come into play surrounding enactivism. So we need to break the links between being diagnosed with the disorder and being subjected to stigmatization and social marginalization. I think, some people find a mere diagnosis stigmatizing. Other people find it extremely helpful because it allows them to externalize their condition and kind of distance themselves from it. So being diagnosed with a disorder can cause harm, but it need not. And I think the cases where it does cause harm, really it has a lot to do with negative stereotyping, stigma, and social marginalization. I think enactivism helps us to kind of break that link because first, it denies that the source or locus of mental disorder is simply the person or their brain. So I think on the enactivist view, it would be a mistake to say like, oh, just point at that person and be like, there's something wrong with you. Rather, it emphasizes that mental disorders are socially embedded, and what is disrupted is the relationship between the agent and their world. And so the problem doesn't lie just on the part of the person or their broken brain or, it acknowledges that aspects of the social environment sometimes impede people's ability to enact social roles, adapt to changing circumstances, and fare well. Thus, the social environment is a possible target of therapeutic intervention. So sometimes the social environment itself is what needs treatment. It needs to be addressed, improved, etc. And I think further work needs to be done here. I agree that feminist philosophy is an important source of insight and kind of teasing out what kinds of social influences are toxic and how certain kinds of social norms and social frameworks and practices negatively impact people. But so I think, again, there's a lot of more that needs to be said. I think enactivism, however, has more resources to address the issues that Russell highlights, and that we need to continue working to address those issues. So that is it.
Okay. Thank you so much, Michelle. I will now invite Jodie to make her reply. And so, Jodie, you have another 10 minutes in order to make a reply. And after that, we'll open the discussion to the audience. And of course, the discussion remains open after that. So whenever you're ready, feel free to begin.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that wonderful response, Michelle. That gave me so much to think about. And I've been like squirreling notes into my notebook and trying to synthesize everything into like an actual comprehensive response. I think what do I want to say in general? I think in general, I think that there's a lot that we agree on, and we're kind of like on the same page in terms of like so more critical work needs to be done to kind of like think about the actual social structure that surrounds discussions of mental disorder. And I think your particular cases were very insightful. Like I like this idea of like taking the principle from enactivism that like overly rigid norms are themselves the thing that prohibits someone from living and living well. I think that's something I probably wish I'd emphasize more at the end when I was talking about the bits I do like about activism. One thing I do really like is the fact that in theory, like because life is multiply realizable, what the good life looks like could look like a whole bunch of different things. And that really kind of like blows the door wide open for like what a good or healthy life can look like. And I think that's a real like boon from the theory, is that like I don't have to look like a specific kind of person. My version of like a good life could be completely different from someone else's and still be like as equally fulfilling and sustaining as theirs. And so like in theory, like anything that's kind of like overtly rigid and maybe trying to fix you into a particular box where like your style of living is restricted, we can easily point to as being part of the problem. And I think your example of gender dysphoria there is like an excellent case where like gender and sex binary clearly does not work theoretically. There are so many people that are made to feel so unhappy and despondent by the fact that they don't fit in these boxes. And so that kind of like is a good case where we can point to and be like, actually, this is an overly rigid social norm, and this is the thing that we need to chuck. In that sense, I think like enactivism can do like a really nice job. And there's a really interesting paper by Butner and Mackenzie in the this is like one of those few days where like you talk about a book and I have the book on my desk so I can like brandish it at you, in the Feminist Philosophy of Mind book, and they apply enactivism to gender and generate this like an active account of gender, and they also argue for all of these kind of like important social and political consequences from understanding gender in this way. So there is potential to enactivism to address more concretely like these like social and political issues that I was worried within the paper that actually it didn't initially give us like the tools to do. And so in that sense, maybe I've been not as generous or not as thoughtful in my own thinking about how to apply enactivism. I think my worry, if it does remain, kind of like comes from a like meta-scientific level of like, how does enactivism itself like construe and construct its like objects of investigation? And given that like you're kind of already involved in like constructing like the kind of person that you're interested in, finding out whether they're disordered or not when you're already in enactive psychiatry, my worry is like, how easy is it then to step outside of that and then be like, actually the way that this is being construed is actually not the way that I would like it to be, or the way that I think that is useful. So I wonder if other perspectives might be useful to have like that stance back, to take that step back and have a look at like, how does like enactivism construe like organisms and how they function, and does that really like get us all of the way? So one thing I kind of like ended up deleting from my last slide, because I was like, I don't want to talk about this, it's too complicated, and also I haven't read enough about it to get into it. But one thing that I thought might be useful to consider as like an addition or supplement to enactivism is this idea that's just kind of like recently been more developed in a book by one of my colleagues at Edinburgh, Masvita Chiramuta, this idea of haptic realism. It's the idea of like scientists in doing science partially constitute the object of scientific investigation. And she very much draws on the phenomenological tradition and Merleau-Ponty, which is also at the heart of enactivism, in order to like develop this idea. So like the boundaries between like the scientist, the science, and scientific object become really intertwined. And my concern then is whether we as enactivists are partly constructing our objects of investigation in such a way that we're not thinking critically about our own presuppositions behind terms like dysfunction and pattern, and that like when you're already working within enactivism, how easy is it to use the tools that you've got to step out and be like, oh, actually this notion of pattern that I'm using is problematic, or this notion of dysfunction could be tweaked to include these things, exclude these things. And my feeling is maybe adding something to the framework that's not enactivism means that it's not as reliant on itself as a framework to make sense of itself, if that makes sense. But I think that doesn't in any way go against anything that you're saying. I think that enactivism can do all that political social work, but when we want to examine the enactivists themselves and put them under the microscope, that's when we can borrow in this feminist philosophy stuff. So yeah, I think there's definitely more work to do, but it's definitely not a dead end. And I think there's definitely a lot of like applicability of enactivism to like these socio-political questions. I like that you brought up the mind shaping stuff as well. I could talk about mind shaping all day. I'm not sure how much time do I have.
Actually, you have about another 4 or 5 minutes, if you will. But we can keep going the discussion after we open up to the audience. We can also keep discussing this point. So don't worry.
Okay, cool. Yeah, if someone wants to talk more about mind shaping, then you can just ask in the chat, like, talk about more about mind shaping stuff. But I think mind shaping is like a useful way, or at least part of what I've been trying to do in like another paper is use mind shaping itself to analyze the activity of scientists like enactivists to understand what are they doing when they conceptualize their objects of investigation. So mind shaping not just like something that like say individuals with mental disorder are subject to when interacting with other people and even medical institutions, but also something like scientists themselves actively participate in. So like the possible toxicity of the norms could be like pervasive in all the way through. So not just like us looking at people, how they're interacting with each other, and whether that's working or not working, from this idea of like overly rigid norms, but also like the norms I'm using to apply to understanding this situation, are they overly rigid and toxic? And so I think leaning back on these like what we want the norms to focus on, and I think I agree with you in terms of like it should be about well-being, and this is what I like about kind of like Janet Karani's feminist philosophy of science, is that it should be about human flourishing, whatever that means. But that whatever that means is what's up for debate. And leaning back on that and using that to guide our enactivism, I think is the next step. But always understanding enactivists themselves as part of the loop of shaping and constructing the individuals that they are trying to study. Was there anything else that I wanted to say? No, other than I think I agree with you on everything, which is nice.
Okay, thanks, Jodie. And we're now open to questions. So if anyone wants to ask a question, you can raise your hand. There's a button at the bottom of the screen with a hand. Perhaps I'll start then by asking a question. My question is for Michelle, but Jodie is welcome to comment as well. So mind shaping, if I understand it correctly, seems to go like in a certain understanding in the direction of like an anti-psychiatry direction, like in the sense that maybe a lot of what we call mental disorders can be really redescribed as like overly restrictive demands of social norms, as you said in the presentation. But at the same time, you mentioned at some point that you did not want to go in that direction, just like, oh, everything can be understood just in terms of social norms. That's probably a role for neurobiology that should not be dismissed. But I did not see, in your short presentation, how does neurobiology fit within the mind shaping framework? So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
So I guess the way that I try to conceptualize mind shaping is in terms of social norms, like social influences generally having an influence on habit formation. And so in a sense, like habit formation involves the formation of neurobiological patterns that involve both the brain and the body. And I also talk about like not just habit, like sensory motor patterns, but also habits of mind. And so this notion that by virtue of social coordination and trying to respond and cooperate and complement each other's behavior and sometimes mirror or imitate each other's behavior, that particular neurobiological patterns form and take root. And so that's kind of like trying like use mind shaping as a way to conceptualize how social influences lead to the formation of embodied habits ultimately. So kind of bring together the biology and the normative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And so I have a question from Enara. You can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everybody. Hi, Jodie. Great paper. Yeah, I think you are pointing to very, very important issues because we are sometimes, most of the time, talking about theoretical, ontological concepts, but then when we are trying to apply the theory to specific practical purposes, yeah, sometimes we find some issues that we didn't expect in the theory. But I don't know if I have a question, but it's maybe a comment. You're saying that, as far as I understood, that enactivism doesn't allow us to distinguish, to disambiguate between norms. So it doesn't provide a kind of prescriptive set of values that the practitioners should follow. And I was thinking whether this would be desirable at all, because, or what we are expecting from a theory of cognition or a theory of mental conditions, because I don't think that enactivism or any other theory should actually provide a kind of set of norms that the practitioner should follow in general without taking into account particular cases. And I think that here also there are kind of two questions, maybe two problems that are mixed. The first one is the constitution problem, but the other one is the status problem. I mean, that this practical problem of how we determine that a person is susceptible of having access to certain institutional resources, to enter into a certain matrices of social practices and so on. And I think that most of the time, I would say that these kind of clinical decisions are most of the time taken in negotiation between different parties, like between the clinician, between the patient, but also the family. So I was thinking that maybe we should not ask or expect to a theory, to enactivism, to provide a kind of prescriptive norms, but to provide a theory that allows or that explains how this negotiation should be made. And I think we can find that actually in enactivism, more precisely in this theory of participatory sense-making and these ideas of engaged epistemology, or that De Jager suggests. So I wanted to ask that, maybe that's the question, whether you think that is it even desirable to have a kind of prescriptive account of mental conditions when it comes to the status question?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Whether this is something that we should want from the theory anyway. I feel like my kind of like intuition was with Nielsen's account in particular, like he's, for my purposes, very usefully clear in terms of like what he wants to do and what he doesn't want to do with enactivism, and that he sees enactivism as doing like the conceptual part of the project. So it tells you what we should call dysfunctional or functional, or disordered or not disordered, and then everything else, explanation, classification, treatment, that's all like separate steps in the project that enactivism itself doesn't necessarily like apply to. But the concept that enactivism gives us is like the through line So like in theory, like depending on how you understand what function and dysfunction are and how the various levels of reality relate to each other, that will then impact, say, like how you then like explain why a particular person has the experience that they do. And then that may also help you with like classifying or grouping particular disorders. And then based on also like this functional notion of well-being and health, you then develop like your treatments like around that and where the intervention comes from. So like it in theory, like it's not supposed to kind of apply that strictly, but it kind of bleeds through, if that makes sense. Like it would be kind of pointless to have like, here's this conception of enactive psychiatry that is supposed to be kind of like decentering the brain and reincorporating lived experience, and then all of your like classifications and therapeutic methods kind of like completely ignored the attempt to integrate the various like levels. Like in theory they should complement each other, I think, is kind of like the idea. But the problem is when you start moving from one project to the next, or this is what I'm worried about, is that like it's not clear how to proceed then. Like if you have this notion of like dysfunction that's quite wide, and that could be quite usefully wide, because it means that like there's wiggle room to have a discussion. It's not meant to be overly like strict. I think that's a good thing, but it makes it unwieldy when moving from one project to the next. Because like if dysfunction could mean a whole different bunch of things, how do we then begin like classifying and categorizing and also implementing effective treatments? It's not entirely clear how exactly you move from one to the next in a way that's going to, because the end goal at the end of the day should be the patient's well-being improved. And it's not clear how you get there in a more deliberate way other than kind of trial and error. But maybe, I mean, to a certain extent, a lot of medicine is trial and error. We don't necessarily know before we start a course of therapy that that's going to be the most effective course of therapy for that person, or even for anyone. But we have like theoretical and principle reasons, and then that's where you can like trial things, right? But I feel like given that we have on the market already these models of mental disorder that also have like complementary like practical implications in terms of like how you categorize people as disordered or not disordered, and then how you might like treat them. So like if you have like a kind of like more like biological like brain-based view, then like your treatments are going to be more biological and brain-based opposed to social, right? What does enactivism give us other than just like massively broadening like the options in a kind of like unwieldy way? Which is why I feel like adding in another framework, so that like you take something that's like almost so wide open you could do almost anything, and just narrow it a little bit more usefully in terms of like, okay, like categorizing it in this particular way, maybe given what we think about what well-being looks like, or what we think human flourishing looks like, that's not going to work. But maybe we'll have this like wide but more narrow like way to go down, and maybe those principles or that way of narrowing down doesn't come from enactivism itself. Does that make sense? I may have just rambled. Sorry.
Yeah. I understand the point. The thing is that how far do we want to go in this narrowing path? Do we want to have a kind of prescriptive theory that would tell practitioners how to do what to do and what kind of set of values they should enact in their treatments, or do we want to make to leave it a little bit open? That's also my worry, because taking this engaged epistemology seriously, I would say that imposing a kind of closed and fixed set of values to determine what is disorder and what is not, wherever this ethical framework comes from, can actually hamper this participation, this evolution, social evolution of the mental health categories that we may want to maintain. This is also linked to the neurodiversity movement and the kind of a dialogue that they are claiming for. So for that dialogue to be possible, I think that we shouldn't have a kind of closed set of values that would determine between health and pathology.
Yeah, I think the principle is to not dictate what the values should be, but I think definitely like what the prompt should be is you should consider the values that are going into like how enactivism is used in psychiatry, in that like, so yeah, I think you're right, like it definitely shouldn't be like top down. Like you wouldn't want a bunch of philosophers being like, so this is how you should understand what mental disorder is, and this is what you should be doing with your patients, because first of all, philosophers are so far removed even though many of us have lived experience of disorder, and many of us are also clinicians as well. There are many philosophers who are also psychiatrists, but there are many people that are not, right? And so, and even if that's the case, that the top down is coming from the most informed philosophers in the case, like they're not necessarily like collectively going to come up with the best solution. So I think that I agree with you. The dialogue should be there. It should be a critical discussion. The crux of my concern is that enactivism in itself doesn't initially like force that conversation to be like prompted, and that like it doesn't initially say like we must talk about what values are going into how we're applying this and have a discussion as about what's better or worse. Whereas I think having like it's not so much about like embedding like feminist values, but more about embedding feminist methodologies of like self-criticalness, of like, is this really working? What are we working towards? And that's where the conversation is being shaped and where the things get narrowed. Because otherwise, like if the conversation is so wide, then you're not really having a conversation at all. But if we're fixated on like more on the priorities of like, okay, we're going to have a conversation now about this framework. What do we want it to do? How's it going to work? Who is involved in that discussion? Who's not involved in that discussion? Then in my mind, that's like a better way forward. Does that answer your question a bit better?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, basically,
Okay.
don't dictate what we should do. It'd be a terrible idea.
Okay, so next one in line is Natalia. You can unmute yourself.
Are you hearing me? Okay, so I've had many conversations with my thesis advisor. I presuppose the enactive model of psychiatry as well, and he is an epistemologist, and he kind of doesn't like this definition of a psychopathology as very rigid patterns of habit, because of even the cross-cultural problems that this can create, because we can easily judge, for instance, very religious people that follow their routine of prayer like very strictly every day as a psychopathology, and that creates many issues with them. Like I was wondering if one can define what's a rigid pattern in a way that's also intercultural, because after this conversation I had with him, I find it almost impossible, really.
That's a really good question, and that just reminded me of something. So maybe I will kind of like steal your question, reframe it, and then throw it at Michelle to answer, because I was thinking this in the back of my mind about like gearing the norms towards ones that are more open and more flexible rather than more rigid. And what does that mean for socially conservative individuals. And I'm saying this on the backdrop of like, we have an election in the UK next month, and we have this opportunity to kick out our Conservative Party. And unfortunately, it's going to get replaced by another Conservative Party that pretends to be more left-wing than it is. This is very hot take. And so there's part of me that's like, oh, these people that are so socially conservative, like, why? It frustrates me on like a very fundamental level. And so a part of me is like, well, what if I can say that they're bad for like the well-being of this country, right? That's a lot of like political and social cachet to be like, we should get rid of these kind of like right-leaning parties because they actually have these overly rigid political views that don't allow people to live how they want to live. So this is maybe I'm kind of like piggybacking on your question, because I'm also wondering, what to do about like not just like an kind of like socially conservative like application of this idea of like norms, but also like just an intercultural one. And that does raise issues in the sense of like looking from the outside into a culture where it may look overly rigid and conservative. And also maybe looking like inside in where being like, so one good one is like female beauty norms, right? Where like in the West, we think that like, there's a lot of different ways a woman can be beautiful, or at least that's how it's marketed to us, right? In all like the beauty adverts, you have women of like various sizes and shapes, different skin colors, using makeup in different ways. It's like you could be any woman you want to be, but then those norms are, when you think about them really deeply, actually quite rigid, in that like the women on those adverts still have like amazing skin. They're still like quite like aesthetically beautiful women. And that it's like one of those things where it's like, well, are you really free? Like, can beauty really mean anything? And so, I will. I want to hear what Michelle thinks about this question.
Well. I mean, the case of religious practices, I think, is interesting, and then, I mean, and then there's like the case of a conservative political party. I don't know if we're gonna say the same thing in all these different cases, but like when I hear about like really strict religious practices, then will that be adaptive within a particular cultural context? I can see that. But I guess I wonder whether being confined to like a really narrow set of behaviors would prove to be adaptive overall, or like enable someone to deal with new situations that might arise. It's probably problematic to say this, but I think some cases might end up being instances that I would be inclined to say like destructive mind shaping. People have been molded by their social environment in such a way that they end up kind of being forced to behave in ways that in some sense that don't mesh with their overall interests or personality or like things that they want to do. But at the same time, I can't necessarily rule out like living like that totally working for someone. So I think it's tricky. See, all these questions are too hard. Yeah. And then I'm also inclined to say that like there may very well be conservative political frameworks that again are problematic because they kind of, and then you were talking about beauty norms that again, like kind of force people into a mold that ends up causing them a lot of distress and anxiety because their particular aptitudes and tendencies don't fit within that narrow framework that they've been provided, and then ends up casting them as outcasts, making them feel really anxious or depressed, or just kind of cases where there might not actually be anything wrong with the person per se, and it's more like primarily the social environment that is causing them suffering and distress. But I think particularly probably going to be tricky.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Are there any more questions? We have time for one last question. Yeah, Tyler, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, can you hear me all right? Thank you both for the talks or then the response as well. That was really inspiring and extremely interesting to me. I'm wondering, or one question I'm having is, or this discussion is making me think that maybe what would be helpful would actually be sort of more naturalism or something like that, or like more empirical studies, like where we're like seeing, like, because as Jodie, as you were saying, like what we want, or what it seems like a goal of psychiatry is like to help people flourish and reduce suffering. And if we're developing models and trying to implement some strategies, maybe we could see, like, I know, like, for instance, in the literature and active literature on depression, there's this idea that the sort of affordance space is being shrunk or something like that. And I think Michelle, in one of her papers, if I'm remembering it right, suggests maybe like dance or something as a kind of therapy modality. So if we were to sort of just see, like, in clinical settings, like what helps, that might help us to pick out like which version or what kind of model is right. And like maybe in the case of the religious conservative person, or something like that, maybe we would discover, okay, they're just fine. They're not suffering all that much. But usually in the case, but probably they are in some way. Or maybe even in like the case of psychopath, like psychopath or something like that, or sociopath. Usually, I think under clinical settings, it is clear that that person is suffering in some way, even though they would say, "I'm fine. I don't need any help." So I wonder if like a way to even kind of say, like, well, there's just, maybe we don't even need a definition of psychopathology. We just know that people are suffering in some way and they don't like that. And we want to try to help them, or clinicians want to try to help them, or philosophers interested in psychiatry want to help ourselves and others. And that would be a way to kind of like overcome these ambiguities, is actually like testing them in the world in order to see, okay, and that seems to me kind of the regular, or sort of this, kind of pragmatist notion of science, like what science is already doing anyways, or the kinds of models that we want to have are just those that have kind of the greatest explanatory power, or kind of have the most effect. So I wonder what your thought would be on something like that. Like, could that be, the ticket, or would that, you think that still would be too, we would have no way to kind of narrow down what kind of empirical studies we might do, or something like that. So.
Who would you like to answer your question?
It was kind of more directed at you, Jodie, but if Michelle has something to say as well, like I would really be interested to hear.
I think, I would be interested to know what Michelle's kind of like philosophy of science is in regards to enactivism, because I think I'm definitely, like, I think you can definitely tell in the paper that I was influenced by what I was teaching at the time, which was philosophy of science. And we were reading a lot of feminist philosophy of science and Thomas Kuhn. And I think that shaped me quite a lot in feeling that, so these are my philosophical presuppositions, if you will, that science is always embedded in some kind of like value-laden activities, in that, like, even if they're pursuing what feel like or look like completely epistemic projects, and they look very naturalistic. There's always some kind of like embedded norms in there somewhere. So I think this maybe connects nicely with like the previous talk in this series from Russell Meyer on the end of enactivism, and he kind of talks about why enactivism as a framework hasn't been taken up by cognitive science, and to a certain extent it's to do with like some epistemic issues, in that like enactivism has all of this like background of like philosophy that's like an expectation that like one has to like understand and read in order to use it. And he wants to kind of like focus more on us doing like just applying it and doing more empirical work. So I think he would be sympathetic to maybe what you're saying about like just make it more naturalistic, just do more science, and then we'll get the answers. Whereas I think my inclination, like I'm more of like the post-Kuhnian kind of like feminist philosophy of science stuff, that like there are both epistemic and non-epistemic norms at play in science. So like not just norms in terms of like what counts as knowledge and not knowledge, what counts as like an object of investigation and not, but also like who gets to investigate that and under what conditions, and how is that project then like shaped? What's the structure of that project? What's the outcome of that project? And so in my mind, like making it more naturalistic, I worry would give us like a false sense of like we're getting at something kind of like objective and therefore rigid. But the rigidity doesn't come from getting closer to nature per se, but actually the rigidity comes from like the particular norms being implemented are of a rigid set. So like determining like this is what enactivism science looks like, and whenever anyone's doing this, they're doing enactivist science. And we kind of do that implicitly anyway. Like enactivism looks very different from, say, embodied cognition or like extended cognition. Even though they have overlaps, they have important differences because they have kind of norms and assumptions behind them that make them fairly distinct. And then enactivism itself is like radically distinct from like computationalism, and there are different ways of doing cognitive science. And so like I think even if we were to say like let's just be way more objective about this, let's just do a lot of testing and prodding, recording the feedback, stratifying it, and that's how we're going to get our results, is in my mind not actually making it more naturalistic. That's just sharpening the scientific norms that you're utilizing. And that's a perfectly fine way to do science. But in my mind, it's not unpicking the norms implicit in the science, which is what I hope enactivists would end up doing. So that's like, at least, but I appreciate that's because of my philosophical bias when it comes to like what science looks like. And if anyone out there is a positivist or a falsificationist, you can tell me that I'm stupid, and that's fine.
No, that all sounded very not the opposite of that, and give me more to think about. And it's a complicated issue, and you've raised a lot of good reasons for me to think that it's not so straightforward. Yeah, so thank you.
All right, so I guess with that last question, we'll end the session. So thanks once again so much to both Jodie and Michelle for your participation, for enriching the discussion on this important topic. Thanks everyone for being here and for asking questions and contributing as well. Now we'll take a break for the summer, but we should be back around September or something like that. So follow our profile on Twitter or check our website, and you'll hear from our next event of the series. So I'll stop recording, and thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you for inviting me and for organizing this. This was.
Thank you, Jodie. Thank you, Michelle. It has been great.